very easy life growing up, and he lost his wife, my grandmother, at far too young an age to Lou Gehrig's disease. And I think it forever made him sad. We were very lucky to have him spend most holidays with us, but by the age of 5, I vividly knew every illness he had ever had, and every one he ever thought he might have, or did have, or could have. And I would also dread when the end of the visit would come. Not just because he was leaving, but because he would end every one of his visits with these words. Well, it's been a nice time, but I'll probably be dead before the next one. As a young child, that was quite traumatic. As a teenager, I found it humorous. But it always worried me, because I wondered if that's actually what he wanted. You know, I can't actually figure out what anybody really wants in today's gospel. This is one of those gospels that gives me a headache. Part of it seems so clear. There are 3 servants who are given something, 2 earn more, 1 doesn't, good, bad. But if you really look into the parable, it makes no sense. Who can tell what anybody wants? First of all, I think it's important to understand exactly what is changing hands between the master and the slaves. A talent was equal to 20 years of salary. 20 years! Can you imagine anyone handing over to you 20 years of your salary? But not only does the master do this, he gives to one 40 years worth of salary and to the other 100 years of working. It's ridiculous. There's absolutely no way a master is going to hand his slaves that kind of money and walk away. And especially walk away without any instruction, any reservation. He gives them according to ability. I think you do a good enough job to get 100 years worth of salary. Seemingly even the worst of the 3 does well enough to get 20. It's bizarre. But even stranger, when the master does return, he is accused of being harsh, a thief, stealing that money that he has given. Intimidating. Not words we usually associate with God, who we usually associate with the master. Yet the master does not argue that he is harsh, or reaps where he doesn't sow. He seems to agree. Before he casts the last slave into outer darkness. I just don't get it. What is this parable trying to tell us? What does God want? While we were in Mississippi a few weeks ago, there was a huge push going around all over the place about a proposition they wanted to pass in November that would dictate to the state of Mississippi that life began at conception. It would seem that most people would want that, at least to acknowledge the right to life. But this proposition called for a ban not just on abortions, which would be expected, but on in vitro fertilization, because life was created unnaturally. And it called for doctors to be held accountable and investigated in every occurrence of miscarriage or premature birth. And my favorite part was that it stated, the rest of the details will be worked out after this is passed. I'm happy to say it got defeated. Not because I don't believe in the sanctity of life, but because there was too much left unsaid and unsure. I have the feeling that somebody somewhere wanted something that wasn't being said. Or somebody somewhere didn't really know what they wanted. It's not unusual to be unsure what we want. As people, our whims change. Perhaps not as quickly as the kids who watch the commercial and want the next thing, but we certainly grow and we modify our desires and our wants. Even the church as a whole, heaven knows, we struggle with change in the light of what we think God may want from us or calls us to be or do. So how do we know what the Master asks of us? How do we figure out if we're earning more or burying? How do we know if we are good and faithful or wicked and lazy? I'm not sure we do. Wait, isn't this the part of the sermon where I normally give you the good news? Well, perhaps the good news is that we don't 100% know what God wants from us. Because then we would know 100% when we fail to do it. And we would fail to do it. All we really know is that God wants us to do something. I don't think the two servants were rewarded because they made more. For the Gospel of Matthew talks about talents one other time. And it's when a servant who has gained a debt of 10,000 talents is forgiven them. Obviously, he screwed up. He made mistakes, and yet he is still rewarded. Because he had done something. When God seems to be angry is when one refuses to even try. When he is lazy, fearful of wrath and retribution. It would seem that all God really wants is for us just not to sit and wait for death. For all the years my grandfather would talk about dying, he did everything he could to live. In fact, I remember one Thanksgiving when he said, you know, the doctors told me I would only live for 6 months with this kind of colon cancer, but here it is 3 years later. I guess I'm too stubborn to die. Well, we had a good time. I'll probably be dead by the next one. I was 19, and it was the first time that statement was true. He lived. And he lives on with God. That's really all God wants from us, is to live. In the end, whether we understand whether this parable is supposed to be about our money or our talents, whether we think the Master is sarcastic about his harshness, or we worry that there might be some truth to judgment, what we can be sure of is that God just wants us to live. To live for him. Waiting and fearing and dreading gain nothing but a mud-covered life. They only paralyze us and squander all that we have been given. Instead, God calls us into the joy of his creation, into a rich and full life, and finally, in death,